Hey, what's up friends? Hope you are doing well. Today we are implementing this slide in overlay hover effect with HTML and CSS. Using this type of overlays is a nice and engaging way to display additional information to the user and can also be a great space saver for a web page. We'll go through a few variations of this effect, changing the slide in direction, the overlay opacity, height, etc. And finally, we'll use a tiny bit of JavaScript just in order to display the overlay upon a click event instead of hover. I hope you guys will find this useful. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and without further ado, let's go! Okay, starting with an empty project, let's create the index.html and style.css files. In the index.html file, I type exclamation mark, says Emmet abbreviation, hit tab or enter, and we get some HTML5 boilerplate code to begin with. Notice that I'm using the Visual Studio Code editor, which comes with Emmet embedded. And let's insert the title, slide in overlay hover effect, and let's also link the external style sheet to the document. Here we are, and we can now proceed to defining the body markup. The main element of this project will be the cart, and by the way, I can do this due to Emmet, which will contain all the content, both the main content as well as the overlay content. Okay, so this is the main structure, and of course you can go ahead and add any content you want, creating portfolio item cards, profile cards, product cards, game cards, etc. For this example, we'll simply add an image as main content and some text as overlay content. So main content will contain an image, and let me paste the image source. We get the image from the Unsplash website, and more specifically, this is an image of Batman. And overlay content will simply contain some text. Let's include it into a paragraph tag, which will be a quote from the movie The Dark Knight, highly recommended movie by the way. So according to this quote, sometimes the truth isn't good enough, sometimes people deserve more. Sometimes people deserve to have their faith rewarded. Said by the Dark Knight himself, also known as Batman, also known as Bruce Wayne. That's all with the HTML markup. Before proceeding to styling with CSS, let's open the project in the browser. For this purpose, I'm using the live server Visual Studio Code extension, which allows for live reloading so that we don't have to refresh the page each time we make a change in our files and want to see the result. So this is what we've created up to this point, and let's proceed to CSS. For starters, I will just paste some basic general styling in order to save some time. I will of course include a link in the description to this project. So we are importing the Acme font family from Google Fonts, setting margin and padding to 0, as well as box sizing to border box for all elements. And for the body, we set font family, width and height to 100% of viewport width and viewport height, and we use flexbox in order to center the content. Not necessarily what we would do in a real life project, this is just for demonstrating the specific example. And we also set background color and color. So let's save and see the result. Okay, now the reason why this is not centered horizontally is that the cart, which contains everything, is a block level element. So let's define dimensions for the cart. And let's set width to 350 pixels and height to 525 pixels. So I decided to keep a 2:3 ratio, which is the same as the ratio of the image we are using. Okay, eventually we will set the overflow property to hidden in order to hide everything which extends beyond the card's boundaries. However, for now, let's keep everything visible in order to have a better picture of what's going on. And next step is to set the dimensions of the main content and the overlay content, as well as for the image, to be equal to the card's dimensions. We can do this by setting width and height to 100% for each element. And let me paste this in order to save some time. Here we are. Nice, and let's quickly finish with styling the overlay content before positioning it. So here is the background color and color for the overlay content. And again, let's use Flexbox in order to center its content. And let's set font size to 20 pixels. And let's also set overflow hidden just in case. Nice, and let's style the paragraph and the span. This styling is irrelevant to the main objective of this video, so I will just paste it. Very nice, and now for starters, let's place the overlay content on top of the main content. For this purpose, we should absolutely position the overlay content relative to the card. Okay, and now let's place the top left corner of the overlay to the top left corner of its parent element, the card. And since their width and height coincide, overlay will cover the card. Okay, and by the way, let's also set the Z index, just in order to ensure that overlay will always be on top of the main content. Now, if we wanted the left edge of the positioned container, in this case the card, to be, let's say, 200 pixels to the left of the left edge of the overlay, then we should set the left position to 200 pixels. Nice, and therefore by setting left to 100%, that is 100% of the card's width, we position the overlay's left edge at the right edge of the card. Okay, and if overflow was hidden, then overlay wouldn't be visible anymore. Now, if we wanted, for example, to place the top edge of the overlay to the bottom edge of the card, then we would set the top property to 100% and left to 0, or 0%, it's the same. If we wanted to position the bottom right corner of the overlay to the top left corner of the card, then we should set top to -100% and left to -100%. Okay, so you see how this works, and let's continue with our initial example. And by the way, just noticed that I'm using REM for the overlay content font size, and therefore it is relative to the root font size, so there is no need to define it here. And what remains now is to move the overlay on top of the main content when we hover over the card. So when there is a hover over the card, we want to set the left property of overlay content to 0. Nice, but instead of this happening instantly, let's smoothen the transition by setting the transition property over the overlay content to half a second. So in this case, we're actually only changing the transition duration, so we could as well just use the transition duration property instead of the shorthand transition property. Very nice, and I think we can now set overflow to hidden for the card. Okay. Now, from what I've read, it would be more performant to animate or move the overlay using the transform property instead of repositioning using the left property. So we could alternatively use the transform property, and since we want to horizontally reposition the overlay, we can use the translate x CSS function. In here, we can use a positive value if we want to move the element further to the right, which is the positive direction of the x-axis, and a negative value if we want to move it to the left. In our case, we want to move it to the left by 100% of its width. Notice that in this case, we are talking about the element's width and not its parent's width, although in this specific example they coincide. Okay, so this is the basic implementation of a sliding overlay hover effect, in this case from right to left, and let's quickly go through a few variations. If we wanted the effect to take place from left to right, then in this case we should initially position it here to minus 100% and move it to the right by 100%. Nice, and if instead of the transform property we went by the left property, again this would do. If we wanted the effect from bottom to top, we should initially set top to 100%, left to 0, and instead of using the translate x function, we should rather use the translate y function. And since we want to move from bottom to top and therefore towards the negative direction, we should add a minus here. Nice, and alternatively we could use the top property and set it to 0. For top to bottom, we should set top to minus 100% here, and now this would work. But if we wanted to use the transform property instead, then all we have to do is change the value here from negative to positive. If we wanted the overlay to slide in from the top left corner to the bottom right, then we should initially set top and left to minus 100%, and on hover we should set the left and top properties to 0. Okay, and using the transform property, we should use the translate function this time. First argument is the change in horizontal direction, so we want to move it 100% to the right. And second argument is the change in vertical direction, so we want to move it 100% towards the bottom. Okay, back to our initial example, the right to left sliding. Now, while sliding in the overlay content, we could at the same time slide out the main content, giving the impression that one is pushing the other. So when mouse is over the cart element, we also want to move the main content by 100% to the left. And let's also add a transition duration to the main content. And we can see both parts moving together in and out of the visible area of the cart, creating this push effect. Okay, back to our initial example. We could, of course, also change the opacity of overlay. So, for example, let's set it to 0.8. Looks a bit better, I think. Or we could gradually increase it. So, starting from 0, on hover, it will eventually become 1. Or 0.8. And by the way, if instead of a slide in effect we wanted a simple fade in overlay, all we have to do is comment this out, place the overlay exactly on top of the cart, and we are good to go. Okay, now although I am tempted to keep experimenting with styling the overlay, I will resist the urge since this video has to end at some point, but guys, feel free to use your creativity and express yourself. But there is one more example I would like to go through for the case where width or height of overlay content is less than width or height of the cart. So for example, let's set height to 15% and let's make overlay content slide in from bottom to top. So let's set top to 100%, left remains 0, and let's also set opacity to 0.8. And let's remove the opacity from here. So on hover over the cart, we want to move overlay content upwards. So let's use the translate y function by 100%. And as already mentioned, this percentage refers to the element's height. So it is 100% of the 15% of the cart's height. Very nice, but in such a case we would probably use less content. So for example, let's reduce the text here to maybe a title, The Dark Knight. And in such a case, a short slide in overlay makes more sense. Okay, back to our initial main example. And finally, in order to display the overlay upon a click event instead of a mouse over the cart element, we should first replace the hover pseudo class with some other class, let's name it slide in, and then use JavaScript in order to toggle between adding or removing this class upon a click event. Adding the class will result in the overlay sliding in, and removing the class will result in the overlay sliding out. Okay, now the hover effect obviously does not work anymore, and of course nor does a click event over the cart element. So let's proceed to defining the JavaScript over here. And let's first store the cart element into a variable for easier access. And next, let's add an event listener for a click event over the cart element. So whenever there is a click event over the cart element, the following anonymous function will be executed. And the only functionality of this function would be to toggle between adding or removing the slide in class to the cart element. So now if I click on the cart, the slide in class is added to the cart and overlay is sliding in. If I click again, the slide in class is removed and overlay is sliding out. So everything seems to be working as intended. Now, if we had many cards, we would use the query selector all here, and we would then loop through the node list, adding this event listener to each element. Okay guys, we are done. I hope you enjoyed this video and got some value out of it. If you did, please hit the like button and share it with anyone who might be interested. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you want more. For any questions, suggestions, or just to say hi, you can use the comment section below. Till next time, keep coding, keep improving, and enjoy the journey. Take care. Bye.